Hey, hello everybody, I'm Munbalance, and I like Reaper. It's my favorite class in Final Fantasy XIV. I also like Crystalline Conflict, which is a PvP mode in Final Fantasy XIV, which pits teams of 5 players against each other in a game to push the crystal to the opponent's side. I've already made a video on this game mode, and something you may have noticed if you watched that video, there's very little or no Reaper gameplay at all. Classes have completely different designs in PvP, and while mostly they are pretty well balanced, I don't think it's a particularly hot take to say that Reaper sucks in PvP. And while balance changes for other jobs have come and gone, Reaper has barely been touched at all. And this is really frustrating for me because while I love Reaper aesthetically, I feel like a liability playing Reaper in PvP. There's also a slim chance that I'll ever get out of Platinum rank playing Reaper. It's also doubly frustrating that someone like me, who's honestly not the greatest, can see massive flaws from a mile away, and it's shocking to me that this class's desperate need for attention hasn't been noticed by admittedly much smarter people who probably spend much more time PvPing than I do. So in this video, I'm going to explain that Reaper is really terrible in PvP, and why it's so terrible in PvP. But before I get into the bad things, let's talk about what uniquely Reaper brings to the PvP table and what it excels at. And I'm going to be honest with you, I had some writer's block at this part in the script. Now, Reaper, funnily enough, functions a lot like a healing DPS, similarly to how it works in PvE. By utilizing Arcane Crest into incoming damage, you can heal your whole squad, and this adds up surprisingly fast, with Reaper having the 3rd highest heal per second of all DPS classes in PvM. And honestly, there's a big drop-off after Reaper. But honestly, that's really the only outstanding thing about Reaper. And pretty much everything else Reaper has, there's usually a better version of it on another class. So what makes Reaper struggle so much in PvP? Well, first of all, as a damage class, Reaper struggles immensely with dealing damage. A very important aspect of PvP, especially in the smaller scale Crystalline Conflict encounters, is burst potential. You need a good burst of damage to confirm almost any kill unless you vastly outnumber your opponents, since everyone has access to Recuperate, which is a 1-second cooldown skill that heals for 15,000, or about a quarter of the average HP. This is generally accomplished with the use of abilities that don't share the same global cooldown as your weapon skills, or by restricting an opponent's ability to recuperate via statuses like sleep, stun, or turning them into an imp. Reaper has 2 abilities, and only one of these does damage directly, and it's not even that much damage. With this, Reaper has a pretty pitiful burst, and will generally do 4,000 damage between 2 8,000 damage weapon skills. The other offensive ability that Reaper has is Death Warrant. This places a marker on the target and compiles the damage that you do to them over the course of 7 seconds. At the end of the timer, it will repeat 50% of the damage accumulated, and this ability will also become Harvest Moon. Harvest Moon is a really weird ability in PvP. It's a ranged ability, and it does damage that scales on how dead your target is, maxing out at 8,000 if the target is at half HP or less. This also absorbs all the damage it does as HP, so it's another heal that you can use. And it's also an AoE, despite Death Warrant being mainly a single target tool, but the AoE is so small that you'll rarely hit more than one opponent with it anyway. Now finally, the burst skill Reaper has is Plentiful Harvest, which we'll also cover later, but for now, I'm just going to say that this allows the Reaper to do up to 20,000 damage, assuming they have 8 Immortal Sacrifice stats. This also has a painfully long cooldown at a whole minute, and even if you were to use it on cooldown, the chances of you getting 8 Immortal Sacrifice stacks is so low that we shouldn't even be talking about it, but we will a little bit later. Now, another issue that Reaper desperately struggles with is a lack of mitigation. Being a melee class means that most of your attacks have to be done very close up. This puts you at a major risk and makes you an easy target for the enemy team. Other melee classes get around these issues by either having exceptional movement abilities, damage-reducing skills, or if you're a Dragoon, both. As we talked about earlier, Reaper struggles with bursting down targets. That means if it's not going to be doing quick peeks and massive damage like Samurai or Ninja, rather its attacks are very drawn out, with most of their damage coming from weapon skills and not abilities. While a Reaper does have Arcane Crest to function as a shield, and this can do very decent group healing, as for keeping the Reaper itself safe, it's really not a great tool. It's an initial 12,000 health shield, and if it breaks, you also get 12,000 healing, slowly, over the course of 6 seconds. I don't know if I need to tell you this, but 6 seconds is an awfully long time to be waiting for 12,000 health. And you've probably taken more damage during its runtime than it'll ever heal you for. Especially with the fact that it triggers when your shield just broke. So you probably are getting somewhat bursted at the time. Now, as for Reaper's mobility, Reaper has its portals. The portals are pretty unremarkable movement abilities, all things considered, but they break the norm by allowing you to, get this, go back afterwards. Now, this might sound super unique on paper, but plenty of classes have both in and outward movement abilities. It's really not that unique. Also, the warp back has its own limitations, and while it's technically twice the range of the initial dash, it can't go through walls, making it very limited as a peeking tool. Along with its 10-second activation window, if you're using this to peek, you might be able to get 2 or 3 skills off before having to use the portal or risk being stranded deep in enemy lines. And these two aspects kind of accumulate to make Reaper just really unthreatening. It can't really peek you and do a huge burst of damage, but it also doesn't have the survivability to just keep wailing on you, which its skills would suggest that's what it wants to do. The next section I have here is on how Reaper is somewhat counterintuitive with itself in a PvP setting. A lot of the skills Reaper has really don't work well with how the class actually performs, and I think as you look a little deeper into it, it really starts to seem egregious how badly some of these skills are designed. First of all, the elephant in the room is Plentiful Harvest and Immortal Sacrifice stacks. Immortal Sacrifice stacks can be gained in one of 2 ways. You either use a Soul Slice, which is on a 20-second cooldown, with 2 stacks, or you get a kill or an assist. Even if you use both of your charges of Soul Slice and somehow get an assist on each and every kill in a whole team wipe of the other party, you still only have 7 stacks of Immortal Sacrifice. You still need 1 more to cap out. And here's where Plentiful Harvest is completely unintuitive in PvP. Plentiful Harvest also gives you a boost to your limit break gain after you use it, meaning that you'd likely want to use it early in a fight, before its stacks build up, and when it's incredibly weak. It's also one of the few AoE skills that you have, so it's something that you might want to throw onto a team fight to rack up assists, but if you've not already racked up assists, it's not going to do enough damage to rack up assists. Also, if you die at any point, you lose all of your sacrifice stacks, and you start back from 0. Honestly, this skill alone makes me wonder if I'm actually playing Reaper, since I feel a lot more like Acrobat jumping through all of these hoops for a relatively mid-powered skill. Another example of Reaper getting in its own way is its shield. Arcane Crest, as we've talked about earlier, is a tool to get you into close quarters. It's relatively weak as a defensive ability, as we explained, but it's also your damage buff skill, and it's a relatively weak one, only buffing your damage by a mere 10% over its duration. But here's the fun part. If you're in a team fight and you take enough damage to break the shield, you'd assume that you'd want to do this because the game rewards you mechanically for healing you when that happens, but guess what else happens? The damage buff goes away. Yeah, the damage buff is tied to the shield itself, not the overall effect of the skill. So if the opponents break your shield quickly, you just ain't getting a damage bonus. And then we have our movement ability with the portals. The portals seem to be designed with the idea that you'd go in, quickly whack a target down, and warp back, but as we've already talked about, the Reaper doesn't have good burst. Its movement ability does not invoke the kind of playstyle that you'd have with Reaper. It would be amazing on a ninja or a samurai, but Reaper is the chunky healer DPS, and sneaking around isn't really what's going to work out for it. You're encouraged to stay with the party to supply them with heals from your Arcane Crest, and while you could use this outgoing portal as an escape option, what's the point of the extra effect then? It feels entirely wasted and it doesn't match the class at all. Also, to make matters worse, Reaper's portals are countered by binding effects. So if you use these portals to try to sneak in and get a kill, but you got yourself into a pickle, you can't even portal back without using Purify. And that's probably something you'd want to save for a much more deliberating status like Stun. Now, next we have Death Warrant, which is kind of confusing. More so the Harvest Moon effect. Death Warrant builds up damage over the course of 7 seconds, and then it does half of that damage afterwards. A few issues. It only counts the damage that you've done, and all of the damage must be done within a short time frame. You only have 2 ranged attacks, one of which is a complete failure of a skill, and the other one is Harvest Moon, which does damage the lower the HP of the target. But its cap damage is just the same of your other attacks, so calling it a burst is kind of overselling it. Generally, you'll want to use your strongest attacks during this time, but that's the fun part. In order to have enough strong attacks during the 7-second duration, you'll have to use your only one other damaging ability, removing the chance to burst them down at the end. Also, another problem, what person is going to let you wail on them for 7 seconds at melee range? You have your heavy debuff, but they could just purify that and run away until the Death Warrant wears off, or threaten you with their own statuses, attacks, and abilities. And if you're on Reaper, they're probably going to do more damage than you. Most of the time, Death Warrant is going to do like 5k at most, since generally people avoid you when they have the giant Reaper over their head, even though the cap damage isn't very threatening either, but it's just so easy to cuck Reaper that people will do it subconsciously. Okay, now let's talk about the limit break. Reaper's limit break is kind of notorious, it's a little bit trolly, but it's also really lackluster. Now, to balance this, Reaper builds limit gauge incredibly fast, faster than anybody else in the game. Like, you can have your limit break ready in under a minute. The problem is that it's a transformation limit break, but you really don't get any stronger. You get a very limited time of 15 seconds to use 4 melee skills, an ability, and finally a small AoE spell with Communio. That's actually the same size as Harvest Moon, so again, good luck hitting more than 2 people with it. While your attacks are a bit faster in your Enshroud, they are the exact same power as your heightened basic attacks. It's very possible to just out-heal a Reaper going ham on you with their limit break. Additionally, your heavy debuff ability becomes a bind, but this only lasts 2 seconds and can be purified off. It's also super possible to just cuck you out of your limit break by pushing Purify, Sprint, and getting out of melee range. Since you only have 1 bind, and once it's spent, your opponent knows you don't have another one to fall back on. The most egregious thing about Reaper's LB is that despite it being a transformation limit break that insists that you get nice and close and start slashing on a guy, there's no mitigation for it. You're just as frail as you were before, and the damage increase isn't noticeable enough to make you a real threat. In practice, the real use of Reaper Limit Break is to deny people their guards. Guard is an ability that reduces damage by 90% and blocks most statuses. It's generally used to stall out and wait for additional cooldowns or reinforcements. It can also be used to deny kill confirms, but with Reaper's Limit Break casting Hysteria and a small AoE around them, this forces all the enemies within range to drop everything and run away from you. The melee class. You know, putting the enemy right where you want them. Out of melee range. What a wonderful ability. Thank you, Square. Thank you, Yoshi Story. But yes, as a result of this status, it will force guarded players to drop their shield and be prime picking for the rest of your team. Not you, though. You're busy morbing on them and can't really move the first second or so anyway. As funny as this status can be and can result in some meme victories where you run the entire team off of the crystal in overtime, this is mainly a failure of the other team. Hysteria lasts 2 seconds, and you need to be off the crystal for 3 for the game to be called. If any one of these affected individuals has a movement ability, or were not literally on the edge of the crystal when you morbed on them, this really shouldn't happen. And also, it's another example of like, hey, Reaper is okay if everything else is going horribly wrong, but that's not really a point for Reaper. At that point, any job would have done a good job of getting everybody off of the point in overtime. But yes, since Reapers can get their limit breaks so often, and the damage potential is basically non-existent, you'll generally be using this to stop people from crystal stalling with guard, which is a neat gimmick but falls very short of what other classes can do with their limit break. Like, yeah, you can force people off of the crystal with Hysteria, but you know what else gets people off of the crystal? Well, for starters, killing them generally works a whole lot better than a 2-second status, but some limit breaks are threatening enough to pressure opponents to leave the point of their own accord. Like Dragoon and Black Mage, generally people back the heck up when they're limit breaking because it just does that much damage. Honestly, one of the worst parts of Reaper is just how easy they are to work around. None of your kit is threatening enough to really demand attention, and the unique things that you do have put complete control of the mechanics in the hands of your opponent. Death Warrant requires that your opponent does no self-preservation at all, and just lets you attack them for 7 seconds straight. And while you do have decent crowd control with your AoE heavy and binds when you're enshrouded, honestly, these are probably some of the worst statuses since you don't prevent the target from just healing through their short duration or just guarding and denying the damage that you might have gained on them with the ability. Also, as I explained before, you're a melee class. If you're attacking them, they can attack you, and I'm pretty sure they bite a little harder than you do. Even their limit break, while taking control away from the opponents for a very short moment, puts it right back in their hands, and all they really need to do to deny you your morb is to push Purify, sprint, and run away. I try not to do direct comparison with other classes in this video because I feel like Reaper is an awful class within its own vacuum, but in case you're wondering, let's do some comparisons, because as it turns out, a lot of Reaper skills just happen to be comparable to skills of other classes. And generally when you look at these skills side by side, it's clear that Reaper has the worst version in almost every example. So Death Warrant, you know what's comparable to that? Wildfire from Mechanist. A 7-second debuff where your attacks build up into a burst when you hit up to 3 times. This works a lot better on a ranged class because you can attack from range. Additionally, Reaper has very few burst tools compared to Mechanist, since they can both drill you for 20,000 and scattergun you for 12,000, and unlike Reaper, you actually have guard pressure outside of limit break since your drill does damage unaffected by guard. Now, you could argue that Wildfire caps out at 12,000, and it bursts immediately upon the 3rd hit, but honestly, I think that's more of a benefit than a downfall. With Death Warrant, you're very unlikely to get 12,000 damage anyway, because opponents are going to be able to avoid your attacks a whole lot easier than they can avoid a Mechanist's attacks. Additionally, by giving you the control of when the burst happens, the opponent isn't in entire knowledge of this is going to happen when this debuff hits 0, because with Reaper, they know that. But with Wildfire, you can hit them early and then the burst happens early, or you can stall it out and they can't really predict the way that they can with the Reaper's burst. And also, while small, Wildfire is also an AoE burst. So once your debuff explodes, it does damage in an AoE. So it could potentially be way more devastating than Death Warrant, given the correct circumstances. Now, another comparison that I love to make is between Plentiful Harvest and Wormwind Thrust from Dragoon. Both of these are cooldown weapon skills that attack in a line and potentially do quite a lot of damage. Wormwind can do up to 16,000 damage in an AoE, and while that is less than Plentiful Harvest, you'd need to have at least 6 stacks of Immortal Sacrifice to make Plentiful Harvest hit that hard. And while Reaper needs a complete collection of limited edition Pokemon cards to do their burst, you know what Dragoon has to do to maximize their damage with Wormwind Thrust? Be far away. And if you're 15 yalms away, you'll do the maximum damage. And hey, it just so happens that the way that you gain access to the skill is by using Elusive Jump. And that's a jump that jumps you 15 yalms away. So immediately when you gain access to the skill, it's ready to do the maximum amount of damage. Wow! Also, let's not forget that one of these has a minute cooldown, and the other one is based on Elusive Jump, so it has a 20-second cooldown. I assume the long cooldown is based on the fact that it boosts your limit break gauge, but we've already talked about how this is honestly an awful effect for Plentiful Harvest, and Reaper's limit break isn't even that good anyway. Now, speaking of the limit break, Reaper isn't the only transformation limit break in PvP. There's actually plenty of examples. Warrior's Primal Scream puts the warrior in the inner release state. This changes their basic attacks to a very damaging Felt Cleave. Additionally, Warrior's Limit Break also puts an unguarded status on enemies and a cone in front of them for the duration of their Limit Break, meaning the enemy can't just cuck you out of most of your Limit Break by pushing guard. Now, Warrior does not get limited uses of their Limit Break attacks like Reaper, so the overall damage that their Limit Break can do is much higher. A total Reaper Limit Break does 52,000 damage over its duration, which is enough to kill a Black Mage if they don't do any healing or shielding for the full duration. Warrior's Limit Break hits for a total of 76,000 damage, and that is without any of their OGCD abilities tacking on more damage. Additionally, Warrior has a more direct gap closer that does damage and stuns, and even has a pull effect to make avoiding them much harder than it is to avoid a Reaper. Also, their Limit Break gives them a 20% max HP bonus, and with the already high survivability and healing that Warrior has, it gives them the longevity that they need to actually stay at melee for a full 15 seconds and not instantly blow up. Oh, and also, it makes the warrior immune to most statuses, like stun, bind, heavy, sleep, and freeze. So you can't just status the warrior and run away like you can with a Morbed Reaper. I'm still not done. Unguarded functionally does the same thing as Hysteria without making the opponent run away. It also does this for much longer, so it's easier for comboing with other classes' big bursts. This makes Warrior's Limit Break very comparable to a Reaper Limit Break, but better in almost every way. Now, the only downside is that Warrior's Limit Break takes longer to charge, but if we want to talk about a Limit Break with a comparable charge time, let's look at Black Mage. Black Mage's Limit Break is Soul Resonance, and it buffs the Black Mage tremendously for a short period of time. So it can be compared to Reaper's Limit Break in the sense that they gain this fast about once per encounter, and it augments their abilities for a set duration. Like Reaper, Black Mage also gets an amount of charges to use their Limit Break, and these charges allow the Black Mage to use their strongest magic spells available, Freeze and Flare. These do 12,000 damage to a target and 8,000 in a 5 Yalm radius. So the Reaper's LB attacks do 8,000, and Black Mage's LB attacks do 8,000 damage in an AoE. And the Limit Break ability also becomes Foul, which is functionally the exact same as Communio without the cast time. And unlike Reaper's Limit Break, this doesn't consume a stack of their Limit Break attacks. So they functionally get 2 more Limit Break attacks than Reaper, not just 1 more. Oh, and Black Mage keeps these stacks for a whole minute, by the way. They don't have to push them all out in 15 seconds, so stalling really isn't an option. The Black Mage can just wait you out. Black Mage Limit Break also gives them a free charge of Super Flare, which Black Mage uses to activate either a pretty nasty damage over time effect with fire spells or various level of crowd control with ice spells based on how many times the opponent were hit by your spells. Also, remember how we talked about Reaper's Limit Break not giving mitigation and making them kind of a prime target for bursting? Well, get this. Black Mage's Limit Break does give them mitigation. It allows them to go on the offensive more easily with their, instant cast, 25 Yalm ranged attacks that apply deliberating statuses. Do you see what I'm talking about? Reaper gets like the heckin' value brand of everything. And playing it in PvP is honestly a test of both my patience and honestly my anxiety, since I feel like a massive liability to my team when I play Reaper. So much so that I made sure to let everyone know on my team that, hello, I'm sorry, I'm covering Reaper. Why am I sorry? Well, because I picked a damage class that doesn't do damage. Almost all of what I do can be done better by another class, and playing Reaper just honestly feels like I'm trying to solve a puzzle with oven mitts on. Like, I know what I need to do to win in many of these scenarios, but I just don't have the tools to do it on Reaper. So why make a super long ranty video rather than just play another class? Well, for the most part, I do play other classes. It's just upsetting to me that a class that I love so much aesthetically and in PvM, in PvP is both mechanically soulless and unbelievably underwhelming. For full disclosure, in PvP, I play Dragoon Samurai, Black Mage mainly, but I've been dipping into Bard recently, and I've also played a bit of Paladin Warrior, and these classes are fun to play in PvP, and a lot of their attacks are super intuitive. I just wish I got that same feeling playing Reaper. And on that note, I actually have a funny story about this. You know, when the new PvP mode first came out, I was feeling pretty weak on Reaper. So do you know what I did? I tried Black Mage out, and I was like, wow, this is way better than Reaper. I'm super threatening, I have a bunch of statuses, and people actually run away when I use my limit break. Not because they're forced to, but for actual real-life pressure that I'm putting on them as a PvP opponent, and that feels cool. Here's the funny part. This was the first patch of PvP, before Black Mage got their dick absolutely absorbed and had basically every skill buffed. So the original Black Mage, which they felt was weak enough that they needed to do all of this, I thought was a considerable upgrade from Reaper, and they still have barely touched Reaper. Now that being said, they have backtracked on a lot of the Black Mage buffs, but they are still stronger than they were originally, and Reaper's still just sitting there, waiting. Now, I'm 13 pages into the script. I think I'm finally out of Reaper complaints. All I can really do is hope for a cool PvP Reaper rework in 6.2, which is just around the corner. I'm not super optimistic about it, but if it does happen, this video can function as a historical piece of just how bad Reaper was. But it's probably not going to happen. Thanks for hearing me out for this long, and if you've got any comments or retorts, put them in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love to argue, so have at it. You can also join my Discord for longer discussions, or check out my Twitch, where I play Final Fantasy XIV every Friday, and other games on Saturday and Sunday. I'm going to give a special thanks to my Patreon supporters who have literally kept me alive this month. You can support the channel for as little as $1 a month and get cool perks, like seeing videos a day early. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.